Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. In this video I want to talk with you about a claim about religion, a claim that may seem a bit strange. Here it is. Rabbinic Judaism is younger than Christianity, or, put the other way around, Christianity is older than Rabbinic Judaism. A little bit of background. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you are a student of mine at the College of DuPage. I've been teaching philosophy and religious studies at the College of DuPage for a number of years. Nearly every semester I offer a section of world religions, and for the last several years I've been asking students in this class to read a book on Judaism by a scholar named Norman Solomon. The book is called Judaism, A Very Short Introduction. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's currently in its second edition. So I asked students to read this whole book cover to cover, not all at once, over the course of a few weeks. And I asked them to complete several assignments based on this book. In each of these assignments, students read a few chapters of the book and they answer some questions based on those chapters. And it's in chapter 2 that they encounter the claim that I just mentioned, the claim that Rabbinic Judaism is younger than Christianity, or, in other words, Christianity is older than Rabbinic Judaism. And I asked students in the assignment on that chapter what they think of the claim. And many of them say they find the claim quite strange, quite perplexing. Many of them will say something like this: well, look, it's just obvious that Judaism is older than Christianity, right? So how can this claim possibly be right? At the same time, they recognize that Solomon is a serious scholar, a legitimate scholar of Judaism. I mean, hopefully they place some trust in my own judgment. And so they find themselves a bit puzzled. The claim seems really strange, but why would they be encountering the claim in this kind of a book unless there was something to it? So sometimes they're quite perplexed by it. So what should we make of it? Well, before we go any further, I just want to say off the bat, Solomon is not the only scholar that makes this claim. Many other scholars have made this claim, and indeed I expect every scholar in the field would accept this claim. I myself accept this claim. Why then might it be that many students struggle with it? And I expect it's not just students that struggle with it. I expect many readers of the book that struggle with it. Perhaps Solomon could have been a bit clear. Perhaps he could have been a bit clear about what exactly he meant by this. And actually, let's take a look at him. Let's see what he has to say. I don't have the book in front of me. I have a printout of the book in front of me. I actually don't have the exact page number in front of me. I know this paragraph comes from chapter 2. Hang on, let's read. I'll read. Here it goes. Here's what Solomon writes. Strange as it may seem, the Talmud and other founding texts of Rabbinic Judaism were actually written later than the Gospels, which were the founding texts of Christianity. When Pope John Paul II, a recent Catholic pope, referred to Jews as the elder brother of Christians, he got it wrong. We are both, of course, children of the Hebrew Scriptures, but in terms of our defining texts, New Testament or Talmud, it is Christians who are the elder brother. Okay, there it is. That's what Solomon wrote. Let's unpack this. First, we have to say a little bit about Rabbinic Judaism. What is Rabbinic Judaism? And actually, I do think there's some unclarity in Solomon's paragraph, right? So maybe we could start with this. If you think about the way we talk about religions, world religions, these large religions around the world, okay? Some are a lot larger than others. Judaism is actually quite small in terms of numbers, but it's often classified as a world religion, maybe largely because of the influence it's had on history and on Christianity and Islam. And, there are Jews spread a bit around the world, but at any rate, when we talk about religions like this, we use terms like Judaism, terms like Christianity, terms like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. You get the idea. These terms are rather general. they're rather sweeping. And the truth is, in many of these world religions at least, we have a number of different movements, a number of different denominations. We have a number of formal divisions, right? This is certainly true for Judaism. Certainly true for Judaism. Some might say that given the diversity within these traditions, at least the ones that have a lot of formal diversity, a lot of formal divisions, perhaps we shouldn't even be using terms like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. That seems to me to go too far. I think the terms are handy, and it's not just that they're handy. You can point to certain, beliefs, practices, history, texts, whatever, that bind them together, even if there's a lot of, there's variation, there's differences of interpretation, what have you. I think we can talk sensibly about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, at least in some contexts, but often we really need to be a bit careful, and we need to track the differences, right? Solomon, at the beginning of this paragraph, and I think what he really means to say throughout the whole paragraph, is not that Judaism is older than Christianity, but that Rabbinic Judaism is older than Christianity. Take the claim Judaism is older than Christianity. You could actually interpret that in a few different ways. I think the most natural way to interpret it, I think the way that many of us would interpret it, is that there's at least one form of Judaism that is older than any form of Christianity. If that's how we're going to take the claim, I think then that claim's absolutely got to be true. Got to be, right? We can use the reasoning that I think a lot of my students use, good reasoning. This is reasoning that Solomon seems to follow. Religions have a lot of components, at least a lot of the religions we're familiar with, maybe all the religions we're familiar with. They have some kind of text or texts, and these are written texts, books that they regard as authoritative, sacred, holy books, sacred books, holy scripture, sacred, text, whatever. Okay. And a lot of us, even if, we're not familiar with the Talmud or other things, we have some sense that the Old Testament is scripture for Jews, sacred text for Jews, holy text for Jews, right? We're going to have to talk a bit about text. I'm going to try to make this as quick and painless as possible, but we got to do it. Maybe I'll break this up a bit, but we'll start with this. Take the Christian Bible, okay? It's got two main parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is a lot longer than the New Testament. As it turns out, actually, there are different Christian Bibles. They all have the same New Testament. They do not have the exact same Old Testament. They all share some books, but they differ with respect to some of their books, okay? If we look at the Protestant Old Testament, it's the shortest of the Christian Old Testaments, and the books of the Protestant Old Testament correspond to the books of the Jewish Bible, sometimes called the Hebrew Bible. Other terms are given to it. We're not going to spend too much more time on that. I'll make a whole other video on that. Different Christians have different Old Testaments. The Protestants have the smallest. The books in that correspond to the books in the Jewish Bible. Jews do arrange those books differently. The arrangement matters, the order matters. I'll discuss that in the other video. Jews don't call those books the Old Testament. They might just call them the Bible. There's other terms that are used in Judaism. A lot of times scholars will call them the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. Okay, there it is. Now, even if you don't really know much about any of that, you probably have a sense. The Old Testament is from before the time of Jesus, and there's no Christianity from before the time of Jesus. And if that Old Testament is from before the time of Jesus, and there had to be Jews connected with that in some way or other, well, then there's at least some form of Judaism that's older than any form of Christianity. So Judaism is older than Christianity. In that sense, yes, that works. Absolutely. Absolutely. But again, there have been many, many, many different forms of Judaism over the centuries, when we look back 2,000 years ago to the time of Jesus, there are many different forms of Judaism. Some of them are mentioned in the Gospels and other books of the New Testament. There are many forms of Judaism at the time of Jesus, okay? And after Jesus died, which happened about the year 30, he was crucified by the Romans about the year 30, about 2,000 years ago. A bit after he died, a couple centuries after he died, we see a movement emerge within Judaism. This movement is often called by scholars Rabbinic Judaism. I've spent a lot of time in synagogue. I'm not a Jew myself, but I spent a lot of time in synagogue. I've never heard an ordinary, everyday Jew use the term Rabbinic Judaism. I'm not sure I've ever heard a rabbi use it, maybe once or twice. Scholars use it a lot. Jewish scholars use it a lot. Non-Jewish scholars use it a lot. It's a term that's used a lot. It's used for this form of Judaism that arises after Jesus. And there are rivals to it. When it arises, it's not the only form of Judaism on offer. It's not the only form of Judaism around. There are other forms of it. Some of them challenge it pretty seriously. But eventually, Rabbinic Judaism emerges victorious. And it's often said that not quite all, but almost all Judaism today is rabbinic. Okay, that's a lot. Let's slow down and unpack some of that. So how could we characterize Rabbinic Judaism? Well, it's many things. It's not just one thing. Instead of thinking of it as a single denomination, it's probably better to think of it as a family or a family of families, a movement of movements, a family of movements, a family of families, right? And it's characterized by certain approaches to what you might call Jewish law, to the mitzvot, the commandments. So just really quickly, a lot of folks who are not Jewish have heard of the 10 Commandments, and we find those more or less in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus is the second book of the Old Testament. In chapter 20, we find the 10 Commandments. But if you read on to Exodus 21, Exodus 22, Exodus 23, you read on, you will encounter more and more commandments. All these commandments, according to the text, were given by God to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. And actually, it turns out that the Israelites, the Hebrews, stayed at Mount Sinai for about a year and received a lot of different commandments, a lot of different mitzvot from God. Jewish tradition recognizes 613. A lot of times Christians talk about the 10 Commandments. Jews often talk about the 613 commandments, okay? And with all such things, with all such commandments, laws, guidelines, instructions, teachings, there's different interpretations about how to understand them, how to apply them, how to live them out. And one thing that often distinguishes different groups of Jews is their approach to those commandments. Which one of those have to be followed today, and how do they have to be followed? And, who has the authority to decide these issues, right? So this is pretty much always a major issue in Judaism. Sorry, I'm swatting away some mosquitoes out here, in the woods. Thought it'd make for a nice backdrop, but, get mosquitoes too. Okay. So it's pretty much always a major issue in Judaism, and it's a major issue for the architects of Rabbinic Judaism, which, by the way, we call the rabbis, which can be a bit misleading because rabbi often just means Jewish teacher, and other movements had teachers as well, and they could use the term rabbi for them. Even Jesus is called some version of rabbi in the Gospels. So anyhow, there it is. So Rabbinic Judaism develops certain ways of understanding those commandments from the Bible, and not just those commandments, but other things. Develop certain ways of thinking about God, certain understandings of theology, and connect with all the certain ways of interpreting the Bible. Okay? And in these ways, it could bear some similarities to other movements within Judaism, but it was also often quite distinctive and very, very interesting. Rabbinic Judaism is really fascinating tradition. And not surprisingly, these rabbis, in his technical sense now, they start writing up their conclusions, and there's a lot of room for disagreement in Rabbinic Judaism, and a lot of room for debate. And minority positions are often preserved, but there's certain frameworks that are taken pretty seriously, and certain results that are pretty foundational. And these rabbis start writing up these results. And, about the year 220 CE, so almost 200 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, we get this text called the Mishnah, which is largely commenting on the mitzvot, those laws, if you will, from what Christians call the Old Testament. But the process of interpretation doesn't end there. The Mishnah didn't clarify everything to everybody's satisfaction. It generates some new questions of its own. So Jewish scholars keep pondering, keep debating, keep writing. They produce commentaries on the Mishnah called the Gemaras. And when you take these Gemaras together with the portions of the Mishnah they're commenting on, you get a Talmud. And there are two Talmuds, the Palestinian and the Babylonian. They're named for the places they were completed. Palestine, the land of Israel, and Babylonia, basically Iraq. There end up being a lot of Jews in that part of the world for reasons I'm not going to go into here. The Palestinian Talmud's completed about the year 450, 500. The Babylonian is completed about the year 550, 600 CE. This is hundreds of years after Jesus. And even if we want to take some recognition of the fact that Christianity, in any form we recognize it today, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, however you think about all that, it takes a while for, Christianity to get going, for robust forms of it to develop. But, however you think about that process, the foundational texts of Rabbinic Judaism, they're not finished until hundreds of years after Jesus is dead. In some cases, maybe like 500 or more years after Jesus is dead, right? That's a pretty long time. And even if you want to say that Rabbinic Judaism isn't wholly defined by these texts, it's largely defined by these texts. And even if you want to recognize that these texts had non-written precedents, right? And, that they were rooted in certain kind of oral traditions and things before them, it's still pretty safe to say that Rabbinic Judaism develops after the time of Jesus, significantly after the time of Jesus. At least the bulk of it develops significantly after the time of Jesus, significantly after there is an early Christian movement that's up and running, or early Christian movements that are up and running, right? When you look at the dates for these texts and the other elements of Rabbinic Judaism, the evidence is it's overwhelmingly clear, it's overwhelmingly strong. Rabbinic Judaism doesn't really get going until a while after Christianity is going, right? And so Solomon's clearly right. Rabbinic Judaism is younger than Christianity, at least to a large extent. Christianity is the elder brother. It's one more quick comment on this before I go on to address some other things. Some of you may be saying, well, I've heard a little bit about ancient forms of Judaism. I know there were different groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other groups. And, weren't the Pharisees just basically the same as the rabbis of Rabbinic Judaism? And the history of this is difficult to work out, but the answer seems to be no. There actually seem to be some pretty significant differences between the Pharisees, which were an important group of Jews around the time of Jesus, and the early rabbis of Rabbinic Judaism. At least this is the way that scholars would think about it. Okay. So, there we are. And then you might say, well, okay, well, if Rabbinic Judaism became important, arose after Jesus and did eventually become pretty important, how important is it today? Well, it's pretty important today. Many scholars of Judaism, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, they will often say that basically all Judaism today is rabbinic. Not quite all. There are some remnants of older versions of Judaism that did not embrace Rabbinic Judaism, but they will often say that basically all Judaism, like north of 99% of Judaism today, maybe 99.8% of Judaism today is rabbinic. There are some ways you can challenge that, right? So if you look at major forms of Judaism today, major denominations, major traditions, so we're looking at things like, Reconstructionism, Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox, as it's often called. And there's different forms of Ultra-Orthodox Judaism and variations within modern Judaism. Okay, when we look at these forms of Judaism, are they all rabbinic in the same way? And what would that mean? So what is really meant here by calling them all rabbinic is it's not just that they have rabbis, in some form or other. It's that they have certain structures embedded in them that we find in Rabbinic Judaism, that they uphold the interpretation of the mitzvot, the halakha, right? They uphold we could say the Jewish law of Rabbinic Judaism, recognizing the authority of these rabbis to interpret the laws and commandments of the Old Testament, right? An authority to interpret, earlier rabbinic texts, recognizing the authority of these rabbis, these authorities within Rabbinic Judaism, recognize their authority to decide all these things for Jews, and that their decisions are binding, right? So, if that is what is meant by these scholars when they're saying that most Judaism today, almost all Judaism today is rabbinic, that claim's actually a bit problematic. I mean, it fits pretty well for ultra-Orthodox Judaism. It fits pretty well for modern Orthodox Judaism. I'd say my understanding is it fits pretty well even for conservative Judaism. Conservative is a bit of a misnomer. There's, in many ways, what is the movement called conservative Judaism is actually quite progressive. But it is recognizing, the authority of these rabbinic texts, the authority of the rabbis that figure in those texts, their authority in interpreting the mitzvot, their decisions about how they are to be interpreted and applied. So within conservative Judaism, and to some extent you have this in all forms of Judaism, there could be some fluidity, some openness to reinterpreting things, at least some things, right? And seeing them in new ways, and some adaptation, to historical circumstances. I mean, you see that already in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and all the early texts of Rabbinic Judaism. There's actually many more that I haven't mentioned here. There's already some adaptation to current circumstances. Just to give one quick example, in the Old Testament, God tells the Israelites, the Hebrews, that they are to perform various kinds of animal sacrifices and other sorts of offerings as well, but also animal sacrifices. And they have to perform these at regular intervals. You could see this, for example, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, right? Okay. And sometimes students of mine, or just curious minds, will ask, well, if that stuff's in the Bible, why don't you do it anymore? Well, because the Old Testament also seems to say that these sacrifices, these offerings, must be made at one and only one place, the temple. The temple. There have been two temples in Judaism. The first one was built by Solomon, son of David. Was finished, I don't know, maybe around the year, what would it have been? Maybe 920 BCE, and then was destroyed in 580s BCE by the Neo-Babylonians. Then the temple got rebuilt within a couple of decades, and then that second temple was destroyed by the Romans about the year 70, and there hasn't been a third temple. So this kind of caused a crisis for Jews, if you're following this Old Testament. And this Old Testament is very clear, offering these animal sacrifices and other kinds of offerings is very important. God commanded Israel to do it. But if you also take the text to teach that you're only allowed to do it at the temple, well, when the temple gets destroyed and another one doesn't get rebuilt, what do? Well, there already has to be some adaptation, right, to historical circumstances. So, often like kind of the more conservative or traditional you are as a Jew, the more you often stress, following, the old ways, the old traditions, and you're often going to, downplay. And I don't mean in a disingenuous way. You really can, in many respects, be following, old traditions, right? But you're often going to downplay, how you're adapting things to new times. You're going to stress continuity with what came before, right? Conservative Judaism is pretty open and vocal about the need to adapt the mitzvot, the commandments, to current circumstances, while also wanting to conserve, hence the name conservative, to preserve, to conserve, right? A lot of the old ways of doing things, and not just the old ways of doing things, but recognizing that those mitzvot are binding, and recognizing that the old rabbis, their general approach to, understanding and applying these mitzvot carry the authority, and that the continuing study of these mitzvot should recognize that authority and be conducted in strong dialogue with it. Okay, so to me that seems, we can call that rabbinic. We can call the more traditional forms, modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism, we can call them rabbinic. There's some other forms of modern Judaism, though, that sit a bit more lightly to that rabbinic heritage, like the Reform and the Reconstructionist movements. And I don't know a great deal about them, and I want to be very careful about what I say here, because I don't want to talk about things that I haven't studied in detail. I don't want to speculate. I don't want to do that. I'll just say my sense is that Reform Judaism, by and large, it does take that rabbinic heritage very seriously, but it views it as much less binding and much more open to supplementation, right? Than you would find in conservative or modern Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, and that within Reconstructionist Judaism, it might sit even more lightly to that rabbinic heritage than does Reform Judaism. Not really seeing the rabbinic interpretation of the mitzvot, that rabbinic halakha, is really having, really being binding at all, or even something that you need to start with, even if you don't have to end with it, which my sense, that's often how the Reform goes. You start with the old rabbinic Judaism, even if you can make sense of departing from it pretty significantly, or maybe even entirely, in various ways. Okay, so maybe it's a bit problematic in a way to say that all modern Judaism, or almost all of it, is rabbinic. Then again, Reform Judaism has certainly been very strongly influenced by rabbinic Judaism, and still exhibits, in many ways, I think, rabbinic patterns of thought and so forth and so on. I don't have enough experience with Reconstructionist Judaism to make any statements about that, but I think in many respects, rabbinic Judaism is still very much alive and well, and very strong. Very strong. So let's get back to our friend Solomon. What did he write again? He wrote, Strange as it may seem, the Talmud and other founding texts of Rabbinic Judaism were actually written later than the Gospels, which were the founding texts of Christianity. Some Christians might want to say it's not just the Gospels or founding texts of Christianity, but also the letters of Paul, the broader New Testament. Okay, all right. And actually, let me pause quick. I don't think I actually commented on the Gospels earlier. Really quickly, you open up that Christian New Testament. The first 4 books you see are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are Gospels, sometimes described as biographies of Jesus. Some scholars say don't call them biographies. Other scholars say it's fine to call them biographies. What kind of biography? There's debates about that. But basically what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you find in these Gospels are records of and reflections on the public ministry of Jesus, okay? Very important text for Christians, very important text for Christians. Central text of the Christian New Testament, very important text for Christians, right? So, and they're all written within a couple of decades of the death of Jesus, right? So Solomon is saying that the key texts of Rabbinic Judaism are written before the written after the Gospels, after the Gospels. They're actually written after the whole New Testament is written. The whole New Testament is written not even 100 years after the death of Jesus. The first major rabbinic texts are written after that, okay? So far, so good. Then Solomon goes on to say, when Pope John Paul II referred to Jews as the elder brother of Christians, he got it wrong. We are both, of course, children of the Hebrew Scriptures. But in terms of our defining text, it is Christians who are the elder brother. Okay, this is where I think things get a bit complicated. Maybe many of my Catholic students, they want to defend the honor of John Paul II. We have this scholar of Judaism saying that this important Pope, John Paul II, important recent Pope, they want to defend him from the claim he got something wrong, and right? And again, after all, isn't it the case that Judaism's obviously older than Christianity? As I've, I think, made pretty clear here, I think we should believe Christianity is older than Rabbinic Judaism, and that does matter. Does that mean that what John Paul II said was wrong? I'm not sure it is. Did Solomon say he's wrong? He did. I think Solomon might have slipped a little bit here, actually. When John Paul II said that Judaism is older, I don't know if he was thinking specifically of Rabbinic Judaism. And my guess is he wasn't. Now, maybe Solomon would come back and say, well, almost all Jews today fall within the scope of Rabbinic Judaism. Therefore, when he said that, Jews are the elder brother of the Christians, he must have meant only Rabbinic Jews. But that does not seem to me to be a very strong argument. I don't think there's any reason that John Paul II would have had to restrict his attention to Rabbinic Jews. And I don't see any reason to think that he did. Maybe he was thinking, yes, of Jews alive today, but my guess is he was probably also thinking of the fact that Rabbinic Judaism is rooted in earlier pre-Christian traditions, right? I mean, that is true, right? And I don't know how, if John Paul II, now we're kind of speculating a little bit about what thought he had in his head. I don't know, maybe he's got some writings on this, we could go track those down, but I'm just not, I don't see any reason to really read John Paul II as having had in his mind Rabbinic Judaism and only Rabbinic Judaism when he made that claim. If he had Rabbinic Judaism and only Rabbinic Judaism in his head, I'm pretty sure he would know the difference, right? And he wouldn't have made quite that claim. And I don't have any issue with him, wanting to include Rabbinic Judaism plus Judaism before that. Now, as I said at the outset, it can be difficult to generalize about things and to just group all, Jews together, all Christians together. But I think there are times where that really does make sense. And I haven't gone back and looked at the context of John Paul II's claims, but I think there's all sorts of contexts where it would make perfect sense. And I will just say, as someone who is a Christian, I think it would make good sense to say, it would be a good thing to say and a true thing to say, and a thing that is honoring towards Judaism, to say that it's our elder sibling, right? It's our elder brother, if you want to put it that way. Okay. So there it is. maybe we can get them both to come out right. Solomon and Pope John Paul II. And one thing I would advise Norman Solomon, a scholar for whom I have a great deal of respect. And by the way, he did a really nice anthologized edition of the Talmud for Penguin Press. But if he were to write a third edition, I would advise him humbly, he might want to spend a little bit more time in that text unpacking, as I did a bit ago, this difference between Judaism in general and these different movements within Judaism, which actually he does do to some degree. I just think that way of thinking, it can be a bit difficult for us to get our mind around when we're starting out. So it's not that he neglects that entirely, but I think he probably could say a little bit more. He starts on it a few pages before the one that contains a paragraph that I read. So anyhow, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it helpful. I hope that it improved and deepened your understanding of both Judaism and Christianity, and also helps you to develop your understanding of religion in general, and that it helped you to develop your critical thinking skills. I will see you in the next video. Take care.